We are not just talking about history tonight. We are plunging headfirst into the inferno that forged one of the most ruthless, religiously zealous, and geographically pivotal empires the world has ever known. This is the story of Castile, the kingdom built on the blade of a sword, whose very existence was a 1,000-year-long act of defiant war against annihilation. Can you believe a single battle, a moment of profound suicidal arrogance, could wipe an entire civilization off the map? It happened in the year 711 AD, a date so soaked in blood and betrayal it should be etched in obsidian. The Visigothic kingdom, the supposed inheritors of Rome on the Iberian Peninsula, was fat, decadent, and utterly unprepared for the storm that was brewing across the Strait of Gibraltar. King Roderick, distracted by petty squabbles and blinding hubris, marched south to meet a threat he dismissed as mere bandits, a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad, who had just landed on that iconic rock we now call Gibraltar. Roderick thought this was an easy victory, a chance to solidify his shaky throne. Instead, it was the catastrophic opening act of the Spanish apocalypse. Imagine the scene, a tsunami of terror washing north. Cities fell not in weeks, but in days. Toledo, the ancient capital, surrendered almost without a fight. Its golden treasures seized, its churches converted, its people left reeling in the sudden, terrifying shift of power. The established order, the centuries-old structures of Christian authority, shattered like cheap glass under a hammer blow. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the end of the known world. Within 7 years, nearly the entire peninsula, from the Mediterranean coast to the Atlantic, was swallowed by the Umayyad Caliphate, a vast, triumphant Islamic superstate stretching from India to the Pyrenees. Europe suddenly had a new, powerful, and terrifying neighbor right on its doorstep, threatening to spill over into France and beyond. A catastrophe no one saw coming, except maybe the few terrified priests and nobles who fled the scorching heat of the south and retreated into the only place left that offered any semblance of sanctuary, the unforgiving, jagged peaks of the Cantabrian Mountains. This was the dark, frozen north, a place so rugged and miserable that the invaders deemed it unworthy of serious occupation. They thought the fight was over. They believed the last flickering candle of Christian resistance had been snuffed out. They were tragically, spectacularly wrong. Because up there, in the bitter cold and the damp mists of what would become known as Asturias, a handful of broken men, led by a shadowy figure named Pelagius, were preparing for the impossible. They were not looking to survive. They were looking to kill and reclaim. Pelagius, a Visigothic noble, or maybe just a local warlord, history isn't clear, which only makes the legend stronger, gathered the remnants. These were the refugees, the dispossessed, the people who had lost everything but their faith and their hatred. Their goal wasn't to rebuild the old Visigothic kingdom, which they saw as weak and corrupt. Their goal was to forge something new, something harder, something defined only by resistance. They were cornered animals, starving and desperate. Their kingdom was literally a strip of rock between the ocean and the crushing power of the greatest empire on earth. And yet, this is where the seed of Castile was planted, not in luxury or peace, but in the grime and the blood of sheer, unadulterated defiance. The Moors called the Christian holdouts Jabal, the mountain. They saw them as a pathetic, isolated nuisance. But nuisances, when cornered, bite. And the first bite, the moment that launched the 1,000-year Reconquista, happened in a tiny, obscure cave high in the mountains, Covadonga. The year is 722 AD. A small Umayyad force, sent perhaps more to collect taxes than to fight a real war, cornered Pelagius and his desperate band. The precise details are lost to myth, but the result is a foundational earthquake. The invaders were routed, perhaps even wiped out, by a combination of the terrain, the torrential rain, and the savage fury of the defenders. But survival was only the beginning. The centuries that followed would be an endless, agonizing cycle of expansion, internal collapse, religious fervor, and breathtaking political maneuvers that make Game of Thrones look like a children's puppet show. We will track the slow, brutal crawl south, inch by agonizing inch, as the tiny mountain kingdom of Asturias morphed into the dynamic, powerful kingdom of León. And then, the ultimate complication, the establishment of the eastern frontier, a dangerous, volatile border region, a land of fortified castles, Castilla, a region so independent and so obsessed with war that it eventually tore itself away from its parent kingdom, León, setting the stage for centuries of internal conflict that were often bloodier than the wars against the enemy at the gates. Tonight, we follow the trail of kings who were crowned on the battlefield and died by the knife, of queens who manipulated empires from behind closed doors, and of the ordinary soldier who believed every step south was dictated by divine will. This is the history of the realm, whose name means land of castles, and whose legacy is written entirely in the language of eternal conflict. Strap in, because the Visigothic darkness has just begun. King Roderick, the last crowned symbol of Visigothic power, was swallowed by the chaos near the Guadalete River. His fate a macabre mystery, his crown perhaps lost forever to the swirling, muddy waters, a fitting epitaph for an empire that died by internal rot long before the first enemy sword struck it. The entire peninsula, which had been ruled by Gothic kings for centuries, was suddenly laid bare, unprotected, and submerged in a terror so profound it altered the very trajectory of European history. The swiftness was paralyzing. City after city, Córdoba, then the vast, opulent capital of Toledo, opened their gates, often betrayed by internal factions, or simply unable to comprehend the velocity of the assault. The Visigothic nobility, more accustomed to infighting and palace intrigue than actually defending the borders, scattered like dust motes in a hurricane. They fled, not fighting for their ancestral homes, but desperate only to save their own privileged necks, abandoning the very people they swore to protect, to the new, iron-fisted authority that swept across the plains. The Umayyad Caliphate, expanding with impossible speed, had claimed 90% of the Iberian landmass in last, installing a glorious, sophisticated civilization known as Al-Andalus. But in the face of this tidal wave of conquest, there was one place the invaders hesitated, one place where the land itself seemed to rise up in defiance. The jagged, tempestuous Cantabrian mountains in the far north. These aren't rolling hills. These are the angry, vertical walls of rock, perpetually shrouded in freezing fog and drenched by the Atlantic storms. A domain too harsh, too poor, and frankly, too much trouble for the mighty armies of the Caliphate to bother fully subjugating. It was here, in this cold, forgotten pocket of rock and mist, that the impossible flame of resistance was lit by a man named Pelagius, or Pelayo. He was an Asturian nobleman, possibly a former bodyguard of the vanished King Roderick, a man whose lineage was less important than the fire burning in his gut, the absolute refusal to surrender his identity. Pelagius wasn't leading a grand army. He was leading a desperate rabble, a few hundred cornered men, shepherds, dispossessed Gothic nobles, and local mountain tribesmen who understood that if they retreated any further, they would fall into the freezing ocean. His defiance was not a political maneuver. It was an act of pure existential desperation. The Umayyads, having conquered the great cities and the wealthy plains of the south, viewed this northern resistance with contempt, a minor annoyance, a mosquito buzzing in the high peaks. But that mosquito bite became infected. In the year 722 A.D., in a narrow, water-logged valley beneath a deep limestone cave called Covadonga, this tiny band of desperate Christians made their final, terrifying stand. The exact numbers are lost to myth and time, but imagine the scene. An Umayyad force, sent perhaps more to punish insolence than to win a major victory, marching into a natural choke point, confident in their overwhelming strength and military discipline. Pelagius and his men, armed with crude weapons, protected only by the sheer, moss-covered walls of the gorge, hurled down rocks, arrows, and sheer, maddening willpower. They were fighting not for territory, but for the soul of their world. The resulting clash was militarily small, but symbolically, it was the birth pang of a 1,000-year conflict. Legend tells of a divine storm, of arrows turning back on the enemy, of a landslide triggered by celestial intervention, a clear sign that the heavens themselves had chosen this tiny, ragged resistance as the vehicle of future glory. The Umayyad force was repulsed, humiliated, and fractured by the unforgiving terrain and the fanatical defense. Pelagius did not win a kingdom that day. He won the right to exist. He carved out a minuscule, fragile enclave known as the Kingdom of Asturias, perched precariously on the edge of the known world, facing an eternal enemy across the vast, terrifying plains. From this impossible foothold, the Asturians began a grueling, agonizing push southward, driven by necessity. They couldn't stay bottled up in the mountains. They needed land, resources, and most importantly, a defensible boundary. As the decades turned into centuries, the Asturian kings, successors like Alfonso I and Alfonso II, slowly pushed the frontier down, inch by bloody inch, across the bleak, wind-swept Meseta Central. The strategy was brutal but effective. Repopulation. They would raid the enemy lands, depopulate the northern territories of the Duero River Basin, creating a vast, desolate, and terrifying no-man's land, a scorched earth buffer zone designed to absorb the shock of any retaliatory strike from the colossal, sophisticated Caliphate of Córdoba. This great vacuum, stretching for hundreds of miles, was known as the Desert of the Duero. It was an empty, haunted land, where only the most desperate, the most rugged, and the most militarily adept settlers dared to venture, lured by the promise of free land and eternal salvation through continuous warfare. These pioneers were not farmers looking for peace. They were warrior settlers, men and women who lived with a sword on their hip and a plow in their hand, expected to defend their small patch of earth against the greatest power in Western Europe. And here, right at the knife edge of this volatile, terrifying frontier, necessity gave birth to its terrible child, the castle. You could not hold this land with treaties or diplomacy. You held it with rock and mortar, with massive towers staring defiantly across the plain, built specifically to withstand the brutal sieges of the Caliphate's endless armies. Every homestead was a fortress, every village a stronghold. The Asturian kingdom, which later became the powerful Kingdom of León as the capital moved south, began to rely heavily on this single, hyper-militarized region. A region where the construction of defensive fortifications was not a luxury, but the absolute, defining characteristic of life itself. A region that demanded eternal vigilance, extreme self-reliance, and a constant readiness for combat, forging a people fiercely independent and aggressively pragmatic. This crucible of unending violence, this land defined by the grim gray shadows of its defensive structures, was given a name that speaks only of its purpose, a name echoing the very thunder of conflict: Castilla, the land of castles. But this new entity was a double-edged weapon. It was the shield of León, but it was also a territory so accustomed to its own sovereignty and survival that it would inevitably, violently, chafe against the authority of the kings who ruled from the safer, richer lands behind the front line. The stage is set. The castles are rising from the dust of the Duero. and the men who inhabit them are about to demand a price for their blood and their sacrifice, a price that will shatter the political structure of the nascent Christian North. The true history of Castile, the history of rebellion forged in fire, is finally beginning. The air was still thick with the dust of the collapsing Visigothic world, but the terror had solidified into a cold, hard resolve in the northern mountains. The so-called victory at Covadonga, the desperate cornering of Pelagius, was less a triumph and more a suicidal defiance that, by some miracle of fate and topography, accidentally worked. Pelagius had bought time, but time in the rugged Cantabrian peaks was a prison, a starvation watch, not a kingdom where men could comfortably rest. The colossal Umayyad Caliphate, having swallowed the entire Iberian Peninsula in just 7 years, viewed these Assyrian holdouts not as a threat, but as a temporary, pestilent annoyance, a swarm of desperate gnats buzzing at the edges of their colossal, shining empire. They assumed attrition would do their work for them. But the successors of Pelagius, the inheritors of this catastrophe, were not content to starve in the rocks. Alfonso I, known to history with the grandiose title of the Catholic, inherited the fragile, threadbare crown and understood the chilling, necessary truth. To merely survive was to eventually die. They had to move. Survival meant expansion, and expansion meant taking back the land with unimaginable violence.
His strategy was brilliant in its cruelty and its foresight. Abandon the wide, fertile lands of the northern Meseta, the Central Plateau, and create a massive, intentional, desolate buffer zone. This was the infamous Desert of the Duero.
It was not a military retreat. It was a scorched earth geopolitical masterstroke. Alfonso I forcibly removed all remaining Visigothic and Christian populations from strategic cities like León, Astorga, and Braga, pulling them back into the safer but resource-poor Cantabrian mountains. He left nothing behind but rubble, salt, and skeletal ruins. He created a no-man's land stretching hundreds of miles, a strip of land so utterly ravaged, so dangerous, and so devoid of resources that even the mighty caliphate hesitated to settle there permanently. It was a land of ghosts, sudden raids, and absolute silence, a vacuum of death that served as the ultimate defense line for the fledgling Christian kingdom. But a void, a vacuum of power, cannot remain empty forever. As the kingdom of León stabilized under later kings, the pressure to reclaim that strategic, fertile, and terrifying land intensified. They needed people desperate enough, fierce enough, and disciplined enough to live permanently on the razor's edge of existential threat, right next to the enemy. This is the precise moment when the blood-soaked legend of Castile begins to manifest into terrifying reality. To hold this deadly frontier, the central power structure of Oviedo and later León simply could not cope. They required immediate, decentralized, and total militarization. Every hillock, every strategic river crossing, every tiny cluster of homes required defense, not just against the predictable large armies, but against the constant, brutal, small-scale razzias, the devastating, swift raiding parties from the caliphate. They built stone walls, not just around major cities, but around their very concept of daily existence. This region, defined by its relentless, absolute need for fortifications and defense, earned its necessary and terrifying name, Castilla, the land of castles. Who were these settlers, these pioneers of the apocalypse? They were not soft-handed nobles or farmers seeking a quiet life. They were hardened men and women, granted unique legal privileges, known as fueros, in direct exchange for living and dying on the front line of civilization. These fueros guaranteed them freedoms and autonomy that were simply unheard of in the safer, more traditional, centralized regions of Asturias and León. They had the right to bear arms instantly, the right to form their own militias without royal interference, and crucially, the right to govern themselves under local custom with minimal taxation. This massive autonomy was the explosive, original seed of Castilian independence. Survival was bought with absolute liberty. They were the shock troops, the human shield of the Christian North. But they never, ever forgot the high price of their service. The moment the King of León showed weakness or tried to curb their hard-won freedoms, the Castilians remembered their founding ethos: rebellion forged in defensive fire. The kings of León, attempting to manage this incredible volatility, appointed powerful military leaders, the Counts of Castile, to oversee these constantly warring, expanding territories. But appointing a wolf to guard a geographically isolated henhouse rarely works out for the distant farmer. These counts were not courtly figures preoccupied with etiquette or luxury. They were warlords, men whose true authority flowed instantly from the point of a spear, not the easily ignored royal seal of the Leonese capital. They were constantly fighting, not just the caliphate to the south, but frequently their immediate neighbors, and most dangerously, the very crown that had elevated them to power. The combination of profound geographic isolation, total military necessity, and the constant existential threat empowered the counts far beyond the king's effective reach. Their loyalty was always conditional, a temporary contract based on mutual need. Their power within the frontier zone was absolute, localized, and terrifyingly efficient. The very original purpose of Castile, to defend the Leonese crown, became, ironically, the precise mechanism for its future overthrow. The stage was now set for the 1,000-year conflict that would fundamentally define Spain. Not merely Christian versus Muslim, but the fierce, rugged, military individualism of the frontier Castilians versus the traditional, rigid, Visigothic inheritance favored by the kings of León. The tension was a coiled, ready-to-strike spring. The Counts of Castile were not mere governors. They were pretenders, kings waiting for their designated moment, ready to turn their formidable, battle-hardened military machine north against their supposed masters. The true reckoning, the moment Castile finally demanded its full sovereignty and freedom from León, was now inevitable.
This was the brutal, necessary prelude to the rise of Count Fernán González, the legendary figure who would take that potent seed of rebellion and plant it deep into the Castilian soil, watering it with defiance and blood until it grew into a self-declared, powerful crown. The land of castles was about to become the kingdom of destiny, and the kings of León were about to realize they had forged their own fiercest enemy. The great paradox of the Reconquista was this: every time a Castilian count successfully defended the Christian north, he grew stronger, and the king of León grew weaker in comparison. León was the ancestral capital, steeped in the old Visigothic law, slow, methodical, and often hesitant. Castile was pure adrenaline, driven by immediate survival and the promise of newly conquered land.
This tension, simmering for generations, was not a slow leak. It was a pressurized bomb waiting for the right fuse. The kings of León had inadvertently created a military meritocracy on their frontier, and meritocracies never stay subservient for long. They demand recognition, and eventually, they demand the crown itself. Then, the political earthquake hit the structure of the Leonese realm, tearing the eastern county right off the map of obedience. His name was Fernán González, and he was not just a count. He was the future of Iberia, wrapped in iron plate and ruthless political cunning. He arrived in the early 10th century, a figure so monumental that the very mountains seemed to bow to his strategic genius, his presence dominating the frontier from Burgos to the Duero River. He was the man who looked at the king of León not with reverence, but with cold calculation, asking himself the pivotal question that would define Castilian history: why should I share this destiny? The tradition had always been that the king appointed the count, ensuring loyalty and rotation to prevent overconcentration of power. Fernán González was determined to obliterate this tradition. His goal was revolutionary: to make the county of Castile hereditary, to transform a temporary military posting into a permanent, sovereign domain owned by his own bloodline. This wasn't just a political maneuver, it was the psychological declaration of independence, transforming the concept of vassalage into dynasty. But Fernán González had already mastered the terrifying art of playing both sides of the religious chasm, sometimes even leveraging temporary truces or shared military campaigns with Muslim taifas to gain advantage over his Christian rivals in León. This was a dirty, existential game, played far from the spiritual purity often claimed by the monastic chroniclers. It was cold, hard political geometry, where survival dictated morality. The Leonese court would summon Fernán González, demanding fealty, obedience, and sometimes even the return of improperly claimed lands. And the count would arrive, backed by a massive entourage of hardened Castilian veterans, making it chillingly clear that any attempt to arrest or truly constrain him would spark an immediate, bloody civil war.
The king knew he could not afford to lose Castile's defensive shield, but he also realized he was slowly being strangled by the very shield he had forged. The years were a blur of minor rebellions, strategic imprisonments, and forced peace treaties, each one weakening León's grip and tightening Fernán González's hold.
The ultimate moment of transformation arrived when Fernán González successfully fought off repeated attempts to replace him, establishing a singular, undeniable authority. He was briefly imprisoned by the Leonese crown, only to escape or be strategically released due to mounting border pressure from the south, always returning to Burgos with even greater popular support among his people. His authority among the common settlers, the repobladores, was absolute and unquestioned. These rugged frontiersmen didn't care about the ancient, delicate laws of León. They cared only about the man who consistently kept the caliphate's scimitars out of their homes and guaranteed them land and liberty. The servant had just purchased his own freedom, not with gold, but with the massive, unpayable debt of blood and stone paid across the frontier. Castile was now operating under its own localized law, a code known as the Fueros de Sepúlveda, wild, brutal laws designed not for courts of nobles, but for men living literally under siege conditions. These laws gave incredible incentives to settlers, granting them rights and freedoms unheard of in the traditional, stagnant heartlands of León, but demanding constant, aggressive military service in return. The Castilian man was not a serf bound to the land. He was a warrior farmer, holding a sword in one hand and a plowshare in the other. This forged a fiercely independent, aggressive, and highly mobile society, ready to march south at a moment's notice to seize new territory. They were the shock troops of the Reconquista, yes, but they served themselves first, and their independence second. The successors to Fernán González continued this relentless, linear trajectory toward full sovereignty. Every generation chipped away at the Leonese crown's authority, utilizing strategic marriages, forging new alliances, and most critically, exploiting the internal weaknesses and constant succession crises that violently plagued the Kingdom of León in the late 10th century. They were a viper that León had nurtured in its own breast, feeding it land and men, only for the viper to grow strong enough to constrict the king himself. The stage was now set for the 11th century, a chaotic, transformative epoch where the center of Christian power would shift violently eastward, away from the old capital. The County of Castile, now fully mature and bursting with aggressive, centrifugal energy, was about to be caught in a massive geopolitical hurricane, pulled into the orbit of another powerful rising star, the formidable Kingdom of Navarre. This temporary alignment would be the final, necessary catalyst. It would give Castile the crucial legal and military leverage needed to declare itself not merely a land of castles, but a crown equal to any other. The countdown to absolute,
terrifying independence had begun, and the kings of León were running out of time to stop the inevitable schism. The stage was set, the powder keg loaded, and the fuse was burning down to the final, inevitable spark. León, the supposed mother kingdom, watched in paralyzed horror as the counts of Castile stopped asking for permission and started making demands, forging international treaties, and acting with the absolute sovereignty of true monarchs. The line of succession through Fernán González had created a tradition of defiance that was now genetically encoded into the Castilian nobility. Every generation of counts was bolder, fiercer, and more politically ruthless than the last, culminating in the reign of Sancho Garcia, known to history as the Count of the Good Law. But the good law he championed was not always peaceful. It was a law forged in blood, designed specifically to circumvent the outdated, archaic authority of the Leonese court in the distant west. While the internal struggle simmered, a greater, existential fire raged just beyond the Duero. The late 10th and early 11th centuries were defined by the terrifying specter of Al-Andalus's greatest warlord, the devastating, unstoppable scourge known as Al-Mansur, or Almanzor. This man was not merely a general. He was the personification of divine wrath, launching annual cataclysmic raids that tore through the fragile Christian kingdoms, burning every sacred relic and city in his path. It was the age of absolute terror, where the survival of Spain hung by the thinnest possible thread, and Castile found its true calling, surviving the unthinkable, even if it meant playing the most dangerous political game imaginable. While King Bermudo II of León often suffered utter humiliation at Almanzor's hands, forced into humiliating tributes and alliances, Castile, through sheer geographical positioning and military pragmatism, often managed to negotiate its way through the inferno, or use the chaos to extract further concessions from León. The counts were masters of double-dealing. They would fight Almanzor one year, only to secure a temporary, treacherous truce the next, gaining valuable breathing room and securing crucial territorial gains, while León was distracted by internal revolts or outright destruction. The last count in the direct line, Garcia Sanchez, was set to marry the sister of King Bermudo III of León, a political move meant to finally, formally, reconcile the fractious relationship between the crown and the county. The assassination was an earthquake. Suddenly, the most powerful frontier county in Iberia was left without a direct, adult male heir. The ancient Leonese kingdom must have breathed a sigh of relief, believing the troublesome countship would finally revert back to their control. They were gravely, catastrophically wrong. The vacuum was instantly filled by the most powerful man in the entire peninsula, King Sancho III of Pamplona, known to history as Sancho the Great. Sancho the Great was not merely a king. He was an emperor in all but name, ruling a vast domain, that stretched from the Pyrenees across northern Iberia. His wife, Mayor of Castile, was the sister of the murdered Count Garcia Sanchez.
Immediately, Sancho III asserted his wife's claim, swiftly marched his formidable Navarrese army into the lands between the Pisuerga and the Duero, and seized control of Castile, not as a subsidiary county, but as an integral core part of his burgeoning empire. This external seizure was the final, critical step toward Castilian independence. Under Sancho III's iron-fisted, yet highly competent rule, Castile was organized, centralized, and treated with the respect of a kingdom, not a rebellious border territory. He poured resources into the region, established clear legal frameworks, and crucially, ensured that Castile's institutional memory and traditions of defiance were not forgotten, but enhanced and legitimized by imperial power. The stage was set for the grand finale. When Sancho III died in 1035, his vast empire, spanning 4 major regions, was systematically divided among his sons, according to complex Navarrese custom, a political partition that would reshape the map of Iberia forever. To his second son, Fernando, Sancho granted the entirety of Castile, but he didn't grant him the title of count. The title Sancho III bestowed upon his second son was unprecedented and devastating to Leonese pride. Fernando was now the king of Castile. The confrontation was inevitable, a clash of ancient prestige versus frontier grit. Fernando, newly crowned, claimed not just his new kingdom, but also the ancient imperial crown of León itself, arguing his sister's rights and the superiority of the newly unified Castilian state. Bermudo III, the last direct male heir of the original Astur-Leonese line, could not allow this upstart frontier region to swallow the ancient heart of the Reconquista. The two armies met in 1037 at the plains of Tamarón, in a battle that would decide the fate of Christian Spain. The fighting was brutal and decisive, in a moment of high drama that changed the course of Spanish history. King Bermudo III was killed in the thick of the fray, the ancient Leonese line extinguished in a single, desperate, fatal charge. Victory belonged entirely to Fernando I. He immediately marched into León, claimed the crown through right of conquest and marriage. He was married to Bermudo's sister, and thus the Kingdom of Castile, forged in defiance and war, absorbed its progenitor. The frontier county, born from apocalyptic terror in 711 AD, had finally seized the central throne. The history of León was over. The history of the unified Castilian dominance had begun. Fernando I, known as the Great, had achieved what the desperate founders of Asturias could only dream of: absolute security. He had conquered Coimbra, subjugated the sprawling Taifa kingdoms of Zaragoza and Seville, forcing the Muslim South to pay him massive annual tributes, the infamous parias, until the wealth of the fractured caliphate flowed north like an unstoppable golden river into León and Castile. The military frontier, the crucible of conflict, was now gorged on gold and power. But the man who forged this mighty empire was about to make a fatal mistake. A strategic error so profound it would immediately plunge his hard-won peace back into the brutal, existential chaos from which it had just emerged. On his deathbed in 1065, Fernando I chose not to preserve the unified, powerful kingdom, but to indulge in the Visigothic tradition of division. He shattered the crown into 5 separate pieces, distributing them among his 3 sons and 2 daughters, setting the stage for a civil war that history would forever remember as the ultimate betrayal of blood.
To Sancho, the eldest, went Castile, the militarized, uncompromising heartland. To Alfonso went León, the ancient capital and symbolic center. To Garcia went the distant, resource-rich lands of Galicia and the emerging region of Portugal. The sisters, Urraca and Elvira, received the important lordships of Zamora and Tora.
This wasn't succession. It was an invitation to slaughter. The fundamental Castilian drive for political hegemony, the belief that the frontier county was destined to rule the whole, clashed violently with the Leonese tradition of legitimacy. Sancho II of Castile, fueled by the aggressive spirit of his homeland, was immediately determined to seize everything his father had given away.
His ambition was raw, his timing immediate, and his military champion was the most fearsome warrior the peninsula had ever produced, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. Already a veteran of countless frontier skirmishes, this man, later known by the honorific El Cid, embodied the relentless, often brutal efficiency of the Castilian military machine. Sancho's first target was the weakest link, his younger brother, Garcia of Galicia. The campaign was swift and merciless. Garcia was defeated, captured, and banished, his short-lived kingdom absorbed into the expanding Castilian sphere. But the true prize, the historic throne, still rested in the hands of Alfonso VI in León.
The confrontation was inevitable, a clash of brothers and ideologies. Castile's relentless military might met León's traditional stubbornness in a series of decisive battles, Castellón and Gorpejera, where the Castilian forces, led by the tactical brilliance of El Cid, proved unstoppable. Alfonso VI was defeated, stripped of his crown, and only through the intervention of his sister Urraca was his life spared. Exiled to the Muslim court of Toledo, a king without a country, living among the very enemies he was supposed to fight. By 1072, Sancho II had achieved total dominance. He had crushed 2 brothers and unified the realm, not through diplomacy, but through sheer, bloody force. Only one obstacle remained: the formidable walled city of Zamora, the lordship held by his fiercely protective sister, Urraca, who refused to acknowledge his absolute claim and guarded the legitimate interests of the banished Alfonso. The siege of Zamora began, a grinding, brutal affair that pitted brother against sister, the ultimate test of the Castilian siege engine against Leonese defiance. Day after day, the Castilian army tightened its grip, the fate of the unified kingdom hanging precariously on the crumbling defenses of Urraca's city. This was where the tide of history turned violently. A single Zamoran nobleman, a figure whose name would forever be synonymous with audacious treachery, emerged from the besieged city, Velido Dolfos. He approached the Castilian camp with a message, claiming to be a deserter, offering to reveal a weak point in the city's defenses that would guarantee Sancho victory.
The king, desperate to end the long siege and claim his final prize, let down his guard. He rode out with only a handful of guards to inspect the supposed breach, believing his campaign of conquest was moments from completion. It was a fatal miscalculation.
The news ripped through the Castilian army like an earthquake. The great conqueror was dead, and the realm was once again leaderless. In the chaos and suspicion that followed, there was only one possible heir left, one remaining brother who could restore order, the banished Alfonso VI, who was instantly recalled from his humiliating exile in Toledo to claim the throne forged in fratricide and murder. But the transition of power was far from smooth. The Castilian nobles, led by the ferocious Alcide, deeply mistrusted the Leonese pretender, Alfonso VI. They suspected he or his sister Urraca had orchestrated the assassination of their king. Before they would kneel, the ultimate confrontation had to take place, a scene of incredible drama and political maneuvering that would define the relationship between the Castilian warrior class and the new Leonese monarch. This dramatic, humiliating ceremony cemented Alcide's reputation as the fiercely independent voice of Castilian honor, but it also sowed the seed of irreversible enmity between the warrior and his king. Alfonso VI had the crown, but he would never forget the man who dared to make him tremble before the altar. The 11th century was not just a renewal, it was a detonation. The small, rugged county of Castile, forged in the ashes of anarchy and ceaseless battle, had finally tasted enough power to make its masters completely drunk on glory. They looked past the rocky frontier, past the Duero River, and saw a kingdom, León, that was too complacent, too concerned with courtly matters, and ripe for the taking by the younger, hungrier power rising in the east. The sword of Castilian ambition was unsheathed, aimed directly at the heart of their Christian neighbors, confirming the terrifying truth that their own kind often posed the greatest existential threat. The year 1037 marked the terrifying climax of this ambition, the moment when the Castilian dream consumed the Leonese reality. This was the era of Ferdinand I, a man history would forever title the Great, and his methods were anything but subtle. He was a strategic predator, inheriting the county of Castile, but his gaze was fixed on the magnificent, ancient crown worn by his brother-in-law, Bermudo III of León, a crown that symbolized the long, often difficult legacy of the Asturian resistance. The clash was inevitable, a tragic, fratricidal war that would decide the fate of the entire peninsula for centuries to come. At the fateful Battle of Tamarán, the full, crushing weight of the Castilian cavalry, hardened by endless frontier skirmishes and fueled by the necessity of constant war, fell upon the ancient, proud, but perhaps less vigorous armies of León. Ferdinand, standing victorious over his fallen relative, did not merely absorb León, he united it with Castile, claiming the imperial title, Rex Leonijones et Castelle. The political tectonic plates of Iberia had violently shifted. Castile was no longer a rebellious minor county. It was the engine driving the dominant force in the peninsula, the sharpened spearhead aimed directly at the heart of Al-Andalus, transforming the entire political landscape overnight. The rugged, militaristic spirit of the frontier had swallowed the grand, ancient dignity of the Leonese crown, creating a hybrid kingdom defined by Castilian aggression and Leonese tradition. But Ferdinand was not satisfied merely ruling Christian kingdoms. His true prey lay to the south, the decadent, wealthy, and politically fractured Taifa kingdoms, Seville, Badajoz, Toledo. These were not unified, formidable enemies. They were golden geese, squabbling over scraps while sitting on colossal mountains of wealth, blind to the Castilian predator circling above. Ferdinand understood the mathematics of power perfectly. Why conquer them fully, expending vast amounts of blood and treasure, when you could simply tax them into economic and military submission? He formalized the terrifying system of parillas, protection money, a tribute so heavy and so humiliating that it ruthlessly bled the taifas dry, funding the very armies that would eventually annihilate them. Imagine the sheer, terrifying audacity, demanding the gold of your enemies so you could forge better weapons and train more soldiers to kill them later. This flow of Al-Andalus gold transformed the northern kingdoms almost overnight, converting them from rustic backwaters into centers of sophisticated Romanesque architecture, grand cathedrals, and unstoppable military might. Every beautiful archway in León, every gilded chalice in Castile, was paid for by the desperate tribute of a weakened Muslim prince far to the south. The grand prize, the jewel that haunted the dreams of every king since the fall of the Visigoths in 711, was Toledo. The old Visigothic capital, sitting majestically on the Tagus River, symbolized the historical soul of Spain and the ultimate goal of the Reconquista. While Ferdinand was too cautious or too busy consolidating his power to conquer it directly, his pressure was relentless. His campaigns cut deep into the heartland, demanding ever-increasing parias from its desperate ruler, Al-Mamun, weakening the city's defenses and draining its treasury until it was just a husk. Ferdinand was meticulously setting the table for his son, making the eventual conquest an inevitability, driven by sheer economic collapse and military exhaustion. But the greatest threat to Castile never came from the south. It always, tragically, came from within. The dramatic, destructive irony of the Iberian kingdoms was that unification was always followed by catastrophic, familial division, driven by antiquated inheritance laws. Ferdinand the Great,
in a final, disastrous act of old Germanic custom, decided that his magnificent, unified kingdom was merely a piece of personal property to be split among his 3 heirs upon his death in 1065.
His eldest, Sancho, a man as fierce and unforgiving as the Castilian highlands themselves, received the militarized heartland, Castile. Alfonso II, the second son, received the more prestigious traditional capital and the title, León. And Garcia was given the peripheral, ambitious region of Galicia. The unified, unstoppable momentum built by Ferdinand instantly shattered into 3 warring fragments, plunging the peninsula back into a brutal, terrifying civil war that paused the Grand Reconquista and threatened to undo a century of painful progress. The Castilian machine, designed for external conquest, was now turning its terrible efficiency inward, brother against brother, and the stage was set for the darkest chapter of internal strife and betrayal. The terrible silence that followed the last great king's breath was not peace. It was the chilling prelude to an earthquake of the soul. Fernando I, the man who had briefly forged unity, made a fatal, unforgivable mistake on his deathbed. A mistake driven not by malice, but by the crippling tradition of division. He split the light of the crown into 5 agonizing shards. He carved out the heart of Iberia and handed León, the ancestral kingdom, to his favorite son, Alfonso. Castile, the fiercely independent, hard-won prize, went to the eldest, Sancho. Galicia, the western jewel, was given to the youngest, Garcia. And lest his daughters feel slighted, he granted the crucial, heavily fortified cities of Zamora and Toro to Urraca and Elvira, respectively. This was not a succession plan. It was a blueprint for fratricide, a ticking clock set to explode the moment the royal corpse was cold. The Castilian machine, designed for external conquest, was now turning its terrible efficiency inward, brother against brother, exactly as the previous chapter foretold. Sancho II, King of Castile, was a man of unforgiving ambition, a man who saw the historical necessity of the unified crown and scoffed at his father's antiquated generosity. Why should the greatest inheritance be fractured into competing, weaker states? Why should he, the senior son, rule only the frontier, while soft, scheming Alfonso held the ancient capital of León? The ink was barely dry on the parchment when the Great War of Reunification began, a conflict driven by bloodlust and destiny. Sancho's target was immediate: the richest prize, the ancestral seat of León, held by Alfonso VI. The 2 armies met at Lantada, a clash of titans where Castilian grit proved superior to Leonese tradition. Alfonso was routed, captured, and his kingdom lay exposed. But Sancho, perhaps blinded by a misplaced sense of fraternal duty, or perhaps simply naive, did not execute him. Instead, he imprisoned his brother. But the political currents of the court are slicker than any dungeon stone. Through sheer cunning and the intervention of his sister Urraca, a woman whose influence over Alfonso was legendary and possibly incestuous. Alfonso was released, but under the most humiliating conditions: exile.
He was banished, stripped of his crown, forced to wander in lands hostile to Christianity, seeking refuge in the court of the Muslim king of Toledo. The king of León, reduced to a beggar in the land of the enemy he was sworn to destroy. The humiliation was total, but the danger to Sancho had just begun, for Alfonso was not.
Sancho then pivoted his merciless attention westward, towards his younger brother, Garcia, the king of Galicia. Garcia was militarily weak and politically isolated. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Galicia was absorbed, Garcia imprisoned, and the map of Christian Iberia was rapidly simplifying under the single, terrifying will of Sancho II. Only two obstacles now stood between Sancho and the complete, unchallenged dominion of his father's entire patrimony: the exiled, vengeful Alfonso and the fortified stone walls of Zamora, held by his sister, Urraca.
Urraca was not just a sister. She was a sovereign in her own right, governing a city whose strategic location was paramount. When Sancho demanded the city's surrender, Urraca's refusal was absolute, echoing across the plains like a challenge hurled from the ramparts.
The siege of Zamora began, a siege that would become the indelible stain upon the Castilian legacy, the moment the bonds of blood dissolved completely into the mire of ambition. Day after agonizing day, the Castilian host hammered at the impregnable walls, their frustration mounting, their morale eroding. Sancho, desperate to end the stalemate, grew reckless. It was then, in that moment of highest tension, that the viper slithered into the camp. Veildo Dolfos, a Zamoran noble who presented himself as a deserter, claiming to be furious with Urraca's stubborn defense, and offering Sancho the ultimate secret weapon. Dolfos claimed he knew a hidden, unguarded postern gate, a vulnerable point in the defenses that only a local could reveal. The king, obsessed with breaching the walls, made the most catastrophic decision of his life. He rode out with the supposed traitor, leaving the bulk of his guard behind, eager to verify the claim with his own eyes. They rode toward the river Duero, away from the watchful eyes of the camp. And then, the ultimate betrayal unfolded. As Sancho dismounted to examine the supposed weakness in the wall, Veildo Dolfos, who had concealed a spear beneath his cloak, lunged. The shockwave that ripped through the Castilian army was instant and devastating. Panic seized the ranks. The king was dead. The siege collapsed. The assassin, Veildo Dolfos, fled back into the safety of Zamora, hailed as a hero by Urraca's people, leaving behind a kingdom shattered by regicide and confusion. The immediate question was terrifying. Who ordered the killing? Was it the vengeful Urraca protecting her city? Or was it the exiled Alfonso VI, waiting patiently in Muslim Toledo for news of his brother's demise. The circumstances were too neat, the timing too perfect. The Castilian throne was suddenly vacant. The armies were leaderless. And who emerged from the south, cloaked in righteous sorrow, to claim the vacant crown? Alfonso VI.
But Castile would not accept a murderer. The stage was set for the greatest confrontation of loyalty and suspicion in Castilian history, featuring the rising star of the kingdom, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, El Cid.
El Cid, the personal champion and standard-bearer of the dead Sancho, refused to swear allegiance to the new king until Alfonso publicly cleared his name. The ensuing scene, the Oath of Santa Gadea, was a masterpiece of high-stakes political theater. Alfonso VI took the throne, uniting Castile and León under one scepter. But his rule was inaugurated by blood, suspicion, and a foundational sin that would shadow his every decision. The unity was achieved, but at the cost of the Castilian soul, and the stage was now set for the explosive era of the Reconquista, under a king who was hated, feared, and constantly suspected of regicide.